All right. Well, we left off where I was sitting in a corner in a railway station in Rotterdam, that's in Holland. And I was just finishing my loaf of bread and my milk, and which I enjoyed very much. And I had inquired before when the next train was leaving for Antwerpen. And they told me, I produced the ticket, and they told me, pointed at the clock, at 6 o'clock that night. Well, I didn't have very long to wait before the train came steaming in, and the guards shouted out, the last train for Antwerpen. And everybody started to occupy the carriages, and of course I picked the second-class one and got into one corner because I knew I was going to sleep. I was very tired. And I wedged myself in a corner, and in no time the train started to move off, and away we went. So in a little while after, of course, I slept most of the time, but I kept looking through the window in the late twilight, and the countryside looked rather good to look at, and I was rather happy with myself too. And about 9:30 we arrived in Antwerpen, and it didn't take me very long to find my boarding house where I was staying. And as soon as I went in, they all looked at me, especially the landlady, and in a wonderment, and said, "Where have you been these last 24 hours?" Oh, then I told my plight, and some were laughing, some were sorry for me, and it was sort of a mixed reception. Anyway, the landlady produced a beautiful tea, some slices of nice cold meat, and Belgian sausage, Danish mustard, and chow pickles, and bread and butter, and a hot cup of coffee to finish it all up. And I felt like a foreign king. But I couldn't wake myself very long after I hit the hay, and no sooner I was in bed that I was fast asleep until they called me next morning for breakfast. And I got out, hot sunshine was shining about, and I had breakfast, and then a dinner after, and then the Latvian runner came to me. He said, "Now it's time to go to the shipping office to sign on the German ship I promised you." So I said, "All right, we'll be off." And he assured me that I wouldn't have much trouble to sign on her, which I didn't either. And I duly signed on, and they always used to give the the boarding house keeper a month's wages in advance for them to see the broken down sailors to sea. You see, while they are assured they are absolutely stony broke, and they get nothing to take with them, to neither working clothes or nothing. And I was very near in the same plight. So they got me a pair of flannel shorts, and a couple of pairs of pants, and a pair of wooden clogs and blanket, and a couple of bars of soap, and a pound of cigarette tobacco, and some tissue papers and matches to see you out for a good while, you know. And in the bargain, they chucked in a donkey's breakfast. You know what I mean by donkey's breakfast? It was kind of a long sock stuffed full of straw. That's for you to lay and to sleep. The ships weren't provided with sleeping facilities. You had to have your own donkey breakfast and your own blankets, with that one blanket underneath and rolled in the other one, and that was that. So we left Antwerp the next day, and the ship was first, I think it went to England, and she was sailing here and there, up and down the North Sea, up to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and Germany, and all over the show, like. And I got on very well with it, and I was so very anxious to study speaking the German language, because everybody spoke German aboard, and so I was very keen. I got a sort of dictionary or interpreter book from my language into German, And then I was bent and studying how to speak it well. And I was on the ship some 8 or 9 months or something, and I was getting rather good at speaking and everything. I was very accustomed to it, and I was getting on well. And one day, if you please, we left London to sail across the North Sea to Hamburg. And is it the River Elbe or something where Hamburg is situated in the delta of the river there was a small island they call Norderney. And on that island in one corner was a small township, also a lighthouse. And we were passing this island one night. I was 12 to 4 on watch. So about 11:45 I gets up to the stockhold door up on deck and was looking at the lighthouse and watching the lights shining at the town. And they didn't seem to me that if they were moving at all. They seemed to be always in the same place. But anyway, 8 bells went, and I went down below, cleaned my fire one side and then the other, and raked the coals back in the center and stalked up. And all of a sudden, the telegram, that's a big bell down in the engine room with a hand pointing on a dial, it kept on ringing backwards and forwards, and it finished up at full speed astern. And the engineer and watch threw the engines in reverse, and they were milling round for a good while, but nothing seemed to happen. And of course I was very curious. I ran up the ladder up on deck to see what was happening, and the ship seems to be there, standing still in the same place where I left it. And you know, without anybody detecting, the ship went too close to the island, or for some reason or other, she touched the bottom, which was very soft, quicksandy bottom, without any collision or something. And she was just quietly working herself into this quicksand. And by the time they discovered that she was standing still, well, she was well and truly bogged in. So next morning they sent some messages or something to Hamburg, and 4 powerful tugboats came down and hooked strong hawsers on the stern of the ship. And when the tide came up high, started to tow her backwards, including her own engines helping, but nothing happened. The tide started to go out again, and they had to abandon everything. So they sent for some more tugs, and 6 more arrived during the afternoon, and they all dropped anchors round the ship so that they could start towing us again about midnight. And they, before midnight came, a good while after dark, a big storm sprang up from the sea, and we were laying broadside onto the storm, and the waves was getting to mangers and hitting against the ship, and the water was going all over the top and smashed all the portholes on the weather side, and all our living quarters got smothered full of water, and the engine room was half full of water. And of course, those tugs cleared out for their lives. Next morning there was nothing but heavy seas running and smashing the ship. And we had to wedge in some corners or somewhere where we could keep quiet so that we didn't get knocked to pieces. And it was that rough that even the lifeboat couldn't get to the ship. So eventually the skipper decided to float an empty barrel ashore at the end of a strong rope. And when it reached the shore, the lifeboat crew got hold of it, and with the help of their oars, they managed to get alongside of the ship. And on the low side, of course, it was fairly good. And they salvaged the crew in 2 loads and took us all ashore. And then, it was well in the afternoon when we all landed ashore. And during the night there was not a show of eating anything or nothing. We were as hungry as the hounds again. And eventually, towards the evening, we were all marched to Norderney, to the township. There was a hotel, and we landed there just about tea time. And we had a good old tea there, and soup and meat and all sorts of good things, and we were set again. Then eventually the skipper decided to divide the crew in two, and one half go on the beach to watch the ship, and the other rest in the hotel. And so we carried on for about 3 weeks. And in a day or two, when the sea got really calm, the lifeboat went back aboard ship and salvaged the ship's papers and quite a lot of stores, eatables, and the ship was well stocked with drinks. There was whiskey and gin and beer, and they carried it all ashore, and we had our share ashore there too, quietly. And after 3 weeks, they decided, we better get back to Antwerp. The ship gradually sunk down, and about 3 weeks after, just before we left at high tide, you could only see the top of the smokestack and the two masts sticking out of water. And of course, she was a doomed ship. And we were taken to the railway station and sent back to Antwerp and paid off at the shipping office. And of course I stayed then ashore in Antwerp for about 3 weeks before I looked for another job. And I was pretty good with speaking German, and I was getting on fairly good. So anyway, after that I got an English ship that was going to the River Plate, that is in Buenos Aires in South America. Buenos Aires and Rosario up the river with the general cargo. And on the way back, they usually carried a cargo of wheat or grain of some description. And we get back, it took us 4 months to make the trip. And on the way back, they generally sent some message somehow or other, I don't know, by Morse or somewhere, that we had to call in Falmouth for orders. On the way home, you see, the shipload of grain was being sold by auction, either to France or Holland or England or anywhere. And then when we arrived in Falmouth, we had the orders to get there to get unloaded. And of course, when we got to England, that was counted as a home port. We were all paid off. And of course, all ends, we went to the station in London, somewhere in, I don't know exactly where it was, but we were bound back for Antwerp. We had to go with the train late in the evening to Harwich. And then at Harwich, we had to board the ferry boat, which went to Antwerp, and 7 o'clock in the morning we was there. And in fact, we had to sometimes wander along the street somewhere and wait until some eating shops open, because we were starting to get hungry. Well, I got back to Antwerp and that time again, and instead of going to live in the boarding house where I was, I went to stay in a sailor's home that was run by a government. And it was so very good conditions there. There was a library there, and reading rooms, and sitting rooms, and single and double bedrooms where you could go and sleep in or do anything you like. The only thing that you couldn't produce any liquors there. You had to go out on the street for that. So I used to always get back to these here sailors' homes. And on entering there, you had to pay 25 francs, that's £1, a week's board in advance, and tell the man behind the counter where you want to go on the next trip. And then they look for a ship, either China, Japan, America, or anywhere. If you mention the place, well, they generally look for the ship for you to go there. So that was all right. I think on the next trip I went to Japan, I think it was. And we were a long trip at sea. We went all the way. We went through the Suez Canal, through Mediterranean first, and through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and up the Persian Gulf, and along the Indian coast, calling in Ceylon, in Colombo. So they call it now Sri Lanka, I believe. And then we called in different places, and eventually we got in Japan. And it was so very strange costume there again, a different place. I've never saw the people before. They had sort of slit eyes and yellowy looking. The woman looked rather good looking, but the man was usually sort of very wrinkly and dark, yellowy looking creatures. And summertime they were all running naked, something like the people in Africa, only they were wearing a big mushroom-like hat on the head. And we lay there for a while and then sailed back again, and I think the trip took us 6 months or so. And then I later on went on the transatlantic run on some ships to Antwerp to New York and back. And they're sailing away there. And one morning a funny incident happened. I was in a ship called Marina, and I went several trips to New York and back, which only took about 3 weeks, the trip. And one evening I goes back to the sailor's room, about 10 o'clock, and I gave instructions to the steward at the office that my ship was leaving at 8 o'clock in the morning, and to call me at 6:30 so that I had plenty time to have a wash and get ready and get to the ship side in good time. And I undressed, took my pocket watch, put it on the chair alongside of my bed, and off I went in a good long sleep. And when I woke up, the room seems to be full of sunshine, and I looked round, and I took the watch up and looked at the time. It was 8:15, if you please, and I should have been on the ship at 8 o'clock. So I jumped out of bed in a hang of a hurry and run downstairs and told the steward what I thought of him for not calling me, and he was full of apologies that he forgot all about it. And I runs down the ship side, and the ship was about 10 feet off the dock side, off the quay side, and I couldn't jump over. So I just stood there and looked at it getting away into the river Scheld and sailing downstream quietly. And there was a lot of farewell wishers. She was carrying a few first-class passengers and general cargo. There was a lot of well-wishers, wives waving handkerchiefs to their husbands that was departing, and some shedding some great alligator tears and one thing or another. And there was a fairly young-looking woman standing alongside of me, and she was terribly sad and waved the handkerchief and sung out and one thing or another. I gazed at her in wonderment that she was sort of heartbroken, although he wasn't going away for more than 3 weeks. But all of a sudden there was a man standing alongside, and he said to her, "Never mind, dear, I'll go home with you and keep company while the old man is away." And she slipped her arm in through his, and away they went, if you please. Well, there you are. I did see some fun in my time. And anyway, I went back, and I stayed the 3 weeks ashore, and waited for the ship to come back. I was going to join on again, but they classed me as a deserter, and there was nothing left in the forecastle where I left my clothes. That was all disappeared, and so I had to get another ship. So anyway, I kept on running out from Antwerp there for just on 5 years, until I was sailing in English ships and different ships, and usually a mixed crew aboard. And I learned eventually speaking English, Dutch, and Belgium, and I spoke fluent German, and I spoke Russian and my own language. So I was really full of languages, and I was well set.